Hi there, Nation, Student Nation Conference. I'm Melissa Harris Perry, and I'm here with my colleague and co-professor,
Justin Esarey.
The two of us both teach at Wake Forest University, and I've been working with and writing with or for the nation for a very long time at this point. This year we did a senior seminar together. So at Wake Forest University, our seniors who are finishing up in our Department of Politics and International Affairs take a 300 level course. And it is a senior seminar meant to bring together some of the core issues that they've learned and provide them an opportunity to write a meaningful research paper. So Justin and I decided that this year we would co-teach together in a course that is addressing questions of data visualization and thinking about issues of inequality. So what we're going to present to you today is a little bit of why we chose data visualization as an important way to think about research, but not only academic research, but also the work of journalism. Because our students not only produce academic kind of scholarly research papers, but they are actually transforming those papers into data-driven visualization pieces and short articles for the nation, and they'll be published later this spring. So we were really trying to bridge the work between both the scholarly and the popular venue. So we're both going to present a little bit about what it means to take data and either visualize it, or in the case of what I'll talk about, making it sonic. And then we'll open it up. We'll have a bit of a conversation between ourselves and then open it up to conversation with all of you. So Justin?
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Justin Esarey. I'm a professor of politics here at Wake, and my specialization is political methodology. I have to say, having taught political methodology many times over the years, it's a subject, I think, that strikes fear into the heart of many undergraduates. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you think about it, I think that data visualization is now something that we all pretty much have to deal with regardless of our profession. I don't know, maybe there's a few people that can still get away without it, but lawyers, journalists, doctors who need to keep up on research, we all need to be able to understand basic quantitative information and especially data visualization. And so what I'd like to talk to you today about is skills of data visualization for modern journalists. That's my opening slide here. And I'm assuming you guys can see that slide. I can't, but I think that's a nature of the display.
We get
great. So I want to sort of have make three takeaway points in my brief talk here. The first is that this is really important for journalists in the modern era, and not just data journalists like Nate Silver or something, but everyone. It's also important for readers too. So even if you're not going to be a journalist, I think you you have to understand how to read these things, read this kind of information to stay informed. And secondly, it is a challenging thing to create data visualizations that are not misleading. But I think that most of those challenges are not actually technical. What I mean by that is, as I said, this subject tends to strike fear in the hearts of students because they're possibly afraid of math or maybe afraid of computer coding or something. And, you can become a very technical person in this field. But I think actually that for journalists, the biggest challenges aren't really technical. They're in just avoiding some pitfalls that are pretty easy to get into. Some of them are even sort of hardwired into the way we think. And avoiding those things and making visualizations that inform the reader and don't mislead the reader. The way to do that is not really to learn a bunch of statistics. It's mostly to learn some things about how we perceive information visually and some things about basic causal inference principles. So I thought it would be best to have an example of what I'm talking about here. So I pulled a graph from the Intensive Care National Audit and Research Center report concerning COVID-19 in Britain, specifically in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. This report came out just pretty recently. And you can see in the graph here, they have the percentage of cases in the ICU, COVID cases in the ICU, what percentage of those cases were unvaccinated people. So in May, in pretty much every region in Britain, you're looking at about 80% unvaccinated. You may remember a news report saying almost all the people who were sick were unvaccinated at that time. And then as time goes on, and especially when the Omicron variant emerges in late 2021, you see those percentages sort of slip. And so by the end, they're hitting a low of 40 or 50% in some regions. And so people were saying, hey, half or more of our patients in the ICU with COVID are actually vaccinated. That must mean the vaccine is terrible, or something's wrong with the vaccine, or we need to get 5 boosters or whatever. And this kind of graph was ubiquitous, I would say, probably in the August, September 2021 timeframe, right when Melissa and I were starting to teach our class. This kind of graph was all over the place. It's harder to find now for the reason I'm about to reveal. So here's another graph that's in that same report. And it's a little, it tells a similar story, but it starts to hint that there's something else going on here. You can see that over time, again, from May to December, the proportion of cases, critical care admissions of COVID patients among adults, the unvaccinated share of that drops pretty steadily, and it reaches about 50%. Just like we just saw. But if you look at the lower stacked bar chart, where you see the general population aged 18 and what proportion of them are unvaccinated, what proportion of them have gotten 1 shot or 2 shots or even 3 shots with the booster, you see that by December 2021, almost everyone in Britain has had at least 1 shot, and actually the vast majority have had 2 or more. And so that's a hint at what's going on here. When almost the entire country is vaccinated, the fact that less than half, but about 40% of people in the ICU are vaccinated means something very different. It does not mean the vaccine is not working. And so the sort of last graph that I want to show from this same report is the rate of ICU patients per 100,000 in each category. So in other words, the orange bar here is the rate among 100 unvaccinated people, how many of them will end up in the ICU. So, you can see in the age group of 50 to 59, it's about 10 or 11 per 100,000. Among 60 to 69-year-olds, it's actually about 40 per 100,000 will end up in the ICU. Whereas if you look at people who've even gotten 1 dose, it's like 1 per 100,000, possibly even less. So essentially, this graph tells a much more accurate story about the likelihood of getting COVID with a vaccine, and also about the effectiveness of the vaccine. The vaccine is incredibly effective, even against Omicron. It's just that so many people are vaccinated now that, even if there's only a 1% or a 0.1% or a 0.01% chance of getting COVID with a vaccine, when you multiply 0.01 by the population of the entire country, that's still a pretty good chunk of people, right? But if you look at the previous graphs, you might think the vaccine is becoming less effective. Not really. The vaccine is becoming more ubiquitous. That's what's happening. And I mentioned earlier, it's hard to find that kind of misleading graph today, because in the US, at least, they have gotten the message that you should not look at the proportion of sick people that have the vaccine. You should look at the proportion of vaccinated people who got sick. And so almost every US graph now is more like the one I'm showing, which is essentially the exact same statistic, but measured by the CDC in the United States. And you can see, yep, Omicron did actually cause some fully vaccinated people to get sick more than they were before, but we're still looking at a rate of 20 per 100,000 as opposed to something like 140 per 100,000 or 160 per 100,000. So the vaccine makes you something like 8 times less likely to be admitted to the ICU. This kind of statistic has been all over the place, right? You could not avoid seeing these sorts of graphs, no matter who you were, over the last 2 years because of COVID. And I think it provides a nice little vignette of what we need to do in order to be better at being data journalists, for those of us who venture into that. And they're not technical things. So, for example, presenting the wrong conditional probabilities, that's what we just talked about, right? You want to look at the probability of getting sick if you're vaccinated, not the probability of getting of being vaccinated if you're sick, right? Just making sure you're presenting the right information is important, and it's not necessarily all that technical. Reverse causality. You want to make sure if you're saying that something causes something else, you've thought about the possibility that causality flows the other way, right? So it's very easy to find examples like, hey, does income cause education, or does education cause income? Well, probably a little of both. We want to be a bit careful about saying, hey, it only goes in one direction. Look at this graph. And then the final sort of basic thing we want to think about is possibility confounding. Is there something that causes both the X and the Y, the cause and the effect, right? So my example here of that is if we're looking at excess mortality rates for COVID, and we want to say it has something to do with democracies or dictatorships doing better. I know it was a common thesis that dictatorships were doing a better job. If you just look at the left graph, you actually see that the mortality rates, excess mortality among dictatorships is a little higher. But on the right-hand side, when you look at the income or the GDP per capita of the country, you see that actually democracies only really do better when they're rich, right? The poor democracies and the poor dictatorships do about the same. It's actually the case that it's the sort of wealthier places that do better, which you wouldn't necessarily get from the first graph. And in fact, from the first graph, you might even wonder, hey, maybe dictatorships are just poorer. And so it's just income that causes both democracy and also doing better at the pandemic. So that's basically all I have. I'll talk about some perceptual errors. I want to give Melissa time to talk here. Those are just sort of almost artistic or graphic design considerations. Again, not particularly technical. You could summarize that whole thing by saying don't use pie charts, because pie charts are some of the most misleading graphs. But you can read books about these things, and like I said, they're not especially technical. Melissa, I think I'll turn it over to you to talk about audio data now.
Yeah, and I absolutely feel like student journalists, if you leave here with no other single takeaway, don't use pie charts. Just don't, like, unless you're actually talking about pie, and I mean PIE, just don't. Okay, so I want to build on this a little bit, because I think what Justin and I certainly both experience in teaching and engaging with students is exactly as Justin was saying, that kind of fear of statistics or fear of quantitative data, especially if you're producing it yourself. So again, let's walk through this a little bit on the slides. I know they're around here somewhere. There they are. Great. So I want to both reinforce what we heard and then also build on that with one other way of thinking about data. So just 3 ways to think about sort of what data can be for your project. So one is analysis, right? And so I think a lot of what you've just heard from Justin is about how we ensure that the analysis of data is appropriate, is accurate, and is in fact the numbers that we want, right? Now, it's not that that part is particularly technical, right? A lot of that is sort of stepping back, not getting caught up exclusively in the matrix algebra or the R coding, and actually asking, wait a minute, what is it that we want to know here? But ensuring that your analysis is the thing that you're actually trying to analyze is absolutely critical to any article, any piece, any aspect of journalism that you're going to produce. It is, as I have on this slide here, it is really the foundation of your house. And then the storytelling, right, is actually the house that you're building, right? So you're going to have some basis of analysis that will serve as your foundation, and then you're going to build the story around it, right? And presumably your story can only fit on top of your foundation. If you go building your story way out to the left or to the right, or up or down, you're going to go too far. Your house is going to tumble, right? So it is critical that you have a strong foundation, and that as you build the house of your story around it, that it has to also fit, right? It has to fit on the basement. And then the third part is the visualization part, right? It is the design, right? So if you're inviting people to your house, you don't typically, I mean, sometimes when you're first moving in, you might invite them to a house to sit around on cardboard boxes. But after that, presumably, when you're inviting people, you have also designed it in some ways that, kind of give you an immediate desire to kind of walk in that front door. And so that's really in many ways what good visualizations, or I even want to make an argument, good audio work is, as well as we're telling our data stories, right? How do we tell our data stories in a way that is most compelling? Why bother, right? Couldn't you just sort of write down the results? Couldn't you just sort of say, the statistics that you just saw presented about COVID, right? Couldn't we just put that in language, right? Why do we need to see a graph? And I think, I just want you to think about how you even likely get a lot of news and information, particularly as we move increasingly into digital platforms that draw you initially through a visualization. Sometimes it's just a meme of Putin at a very long table, right? And sort of what that might mean, what that might demonstrate. But ideally, right, you're not just being drawn in by memes about world events, but you're actually, sort of the best use of that kind of digital space when you're trying to do important storytelling is to be able to create compelling visualizations that draw in, right, not only digital audiences, draw in readers, and presumably sometimes data are a little, although they can be described in words, sometimes describing them in language does begin to feel so technical and analytic that it becomes difficult for folks to relate to. But if you give them the right visualization or the right audio story, it can, again, allow the data to live, right, in order to allow those numbers, that quantitative analysis, to have a meaning that goes, again, beyond the expertise. All right, now let's go through a couple possibilities here. So that's just sort of reinforcing what you just heard. And again, both text, right, so the things that you're writing in your stories, and data visualizations, they're languages for telling the story of your analysis, but there's also a language that is audio. And when we get to our conversation, just so so Justin knows, I'm going to be asking about noisy data, because in fact, the notion of kind of a sonic language for our data is one of the things that led me to wanting to think about audio and kind of sonic representations. But of course, the other reason I want to talk and think about sonic representations is because I host a radio show. And so in hosting a radio show, I don't have the opportunity, in fact, to have visualizations. I used to host a television show and had the opportunity for visualizations. But now the question is, how can I tell a story by just what you can hear? If you can't see me, if you could only hear me. And so what I want to suggest is that sometimes there are times when we want to draw people into our story by seeing our data. There are other times when it might make sense to actually hear our data, or for those two things to go together. And there are three times. I'm going to say when the data themselves are about sound, which I'll give you an example of, when the voices matter, and when hearing those voices actually conveys additional data or information, and when representing data as sound actually reveals something unexpected. So let's go through each of those. The first is there are times when the data themselves are sonic. Sorry, that was just a different way of telling the same thing. Sorry. There are times when the data themselves are actually sonic. A great example of this is about noise pollution and the question of whether or not noise pollution is a public health crisis. So I have a link there. I won't pull it up now. I can later if you all ask. But we did a segment on the radio show I host about the idea of noise pollution. And if I just say to you noise pollution, especially because we tend to think of pollution not as sonic, you might think, what are you talking about, lady? Like what constitutes noise pollution? In order to tell that story, you need to hear it, right? I need to actually play for you noise pollution. So even though it's a story that in terms of the public health data, the epidemiology work, we're going to show it a data visualization, right? We're going to show how higher decibels or greater exposure actually leads to a whole series of public health concerns. What you really want is for your data visualization to also be audio so that someone can click and say, if I say to you 10 decibels, what does that mean? Like nothing really. But if you hear it, right, if you can hear the whisper, and then you can hear the louder, and then you can hear the crashing, and then you can hear the shouting, and right, then all of a sudden you're like, oh, that's right, that's where we're going when I can hear actually hear it. So whenever your data are in fact about sound, I think there's a lot of value in trying to incorporate some kind of sonic representation of your data in addition to your visual representation. One of the great examples of this for those of you who are New Yorkers or maybe who live in any big city is thinking about what happened at the early part of quarantine. And the world became very quiet. I would encourage you again to take a look at this New York Times story. They're showing basically how quiet it becomes. Again, you can see those hills and valley, but there's nothing like clicking and actually hearing, right, what it sounds like in New York City in those first weeks of quarantine when the din of the city goes down because people go inside, right? And you can begin to get a sense of just how different the world was, not only in all of the ways that we were experiencing, but also even in the volume. The second time you might want to use audio storytelling is when actually hearing voices matters. So in our student projects, we had one student group that was working on parental incarceration. We had a student group that was working on pandemic policies, specifically kind of the trade-off between economic health and human health. And whether or not there actually was a trade-off. And then we also had another group that was looking at issues of race and health and actually political representation. The idea if you are racially matched with the people who represent you in Congress and the Senate, and most importantly, in their work in the state legislature, does it have an impact on your health? And so in all of those cases, yes, all of our students did visual representations, but these are also the kinds of stories where hearing the voices of people who are affected by this actually matters. You can talk about, you can write about, you can talk about, or an expert can talk about parental incarceration, but there is nothing quite like hearing a child talk about what it means to visit their parent in jail. You can talk about pandemic policies of economy versus health. You can bring an expert to do it, but there's nothing quite like talking to an actual frontline worker, whether that's a nurse in an emergency room or whether that is the cashier at the grocery store. When those voices matter, and often when those are voices that are less frequently showing up as experts, then again, an audio or a sonic aspect of your work can matter a lot. And then finally, on this question of race and health and representation, again, hearing from people who are experiencing any series of health issues that you're concerned about. Our students were particularly concerned about heart health, but it might be that you're interested in questions of diabetes, that you're looking at maternal health outcomes. Yes, again, experts matter, but sometimes that expertise is also emerging from individuals themselves, and hearing those voices in connection to seeing those data can make a big difference in the house that you're building. All right, and then the final suggestion around when to think about also using sonic data is on the question of when hearing something actually reveals something new in your data. So the link here, this New York Times link, is to the sound of the Vegas mass shooter. And again, if you all want to hear it, I'll be happy to click on it. We can listen to it together. Again, we can talk about automatic weapons. We can write about them. We can show visually the difference in what happens in terms of the number of bullets that can be shot in any given 30 seconds. But in a mass shooting, you typically don't see bullets, you hear them, right? You hear the shots. And so again, in this case, this data is in part, it's not that it's data about sound, it's actually data about the physical event of shooting. But when you hear it, again, it brings a kind of clarity. So when you hear what an automatic weapon sounds like versus what a weapon that has to be reloaded sounds like, you get a clear sense of the differential in their deadliness. All right, so I'm going to pause there because what we wanted to do was just kind of begin by giving you an overall sense. And then I think we're going to come out. We've sort of burned our first 25 minutes or so. And I think we really want to spend as much time as possible in this last half hour, really giving you all an opportunity to ask questions. Now, I already have some questions for Justin and some other things, but I see that we've got some questions already and would be really happy to go back. I think some folks are asking about some of our slides. I can also say I'm certainly willing to make the slides available for everybody. So especially since mine have some hot links so that you all could also see them and spend some time with them later.
Of course, I'll do the same.
Justin, one question that I see here is from a late stage political science PhD student. So of course my eyes go directly to that one. I've had ample training in data visualization for political science studies. Is there a difference in your view in how journalists should approach data visualization versus how a political scientist might approach it for academic journals? So you just had an experience with this fairly recently.
Yes. Next question. No. Yeah, there's a big difference. I think, how do I categorize this? First of all, I think a lot of what's going on in journalism data visualization is just trying to communicate certain relatively simple facts and possibly some crude causal connections in the sense of, saying one thing made another thing happen, not necessarily testing a theory about why something happened. You do in opinion pieces see theories being offered, but I think for the most part, you don't see the kind of theory testing that you might in an academic article. Also, I think academic articles are speaking to a much more technically savvy audience. And so you have the freedom to not worry about some things as much, whether certain things are clear, whether something contains too much information. And so Melissa was talking about, I wrote this article for The Atlantic that was the first time I'd ever really done something for a popular outlet. Well, popular. I mean, it's an intellectual journalism magazine, right? Not necessarily Sports Illustrated, but still. I think I was much more concerned in that article with communicating things that I could back up with more complex analysis if I needed to. And actually, I did do that, but I didn't report all that stuff, right? And my visualizations were meant to communicate the truth as I could best understand it, and that I could support with those other models without necessarily reporting all the models, right? I I just was trying to show, here are my results. Here are the reasons I think those results are true. And yes, I did have other things backing it up if I needed to. Whereas in an academic article, I would have definitely presented those things. I may have even presented those more technical analyses first. So it's definitely not that, pop journalism pieces need to be, I hear some people saying, oh, they're dumbed down or whatever. I don't think that's true. I think you're just speaking to a group of people who don't do this every day, all day. And you do have to try to put yourself in their position and maybe even vet your work through, intelligent but non-technical people to make sure you're getting through.
Yeah, and I feel like there's increasingly a model, right? As sort of your point, Justin, that data journalism, like people who actually think of themselves as data journalists or sites that think of themselves this way, are increasingly trying to find a balance of this sort of cutting through and being clear in the presentation of sort of single results, right, that can be discussed in a discernible way, right, within a relatively short piece, versus the critical importance of showing your work. And so I think this is part of what digital world provides us that print world doesn't. So print world just does have limitations. There's just only so many pages in the print version of The Nation, for example, that you can use. But the digital space is presumably infinite. And so I would also encourage you to think about ways that, again, as Justin said, in an academic article, right, we may be leading with all of those sort of alternatives that we've tried, right, coming to this sort of key conclusion. But you can always do a show your work, right, that is pointed to digitally, that allows those who are more technically savvy, allows for the kind of aspect that is, replication, right? That we think of as the cornerstone of academic work, right? That capacity to replicate is part of how we know that we can trust one another when we're publishing this work. And it is actually sort of setting up the possibility of peer review by doing that. I'm on the board of trustees of the Markup, for those of you who are interested in tech journalism, and they have a very sort of upfront process of showing their work in exactly that way. So I'd encourage you to be Markup readers as well. Mariah Martin asked about using methods like this on subjective issues such as racial inequalities and gender inequalities, and saying a lot of the data that's collected is collected from subjective perspective, making it difficult to give an objective report. So I want to push back and say, one, I think that actually, even when you are collecting data about subjective experiences, you can still give an objective report of that data. So if I go out into the world and ask people how they feel about the police, if there is a meaningful difference between how African Americans, white Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans, and Indigenous folks experience and feel about the police, that doesn't tell us, that doesn't adjudicate which of those groups is right, who has the accurate perception. But those differences in that subjective experience are also politically meaningful, right? Socially meaningful. And not only can you, but I think it's absolutely critical to objectively report those. And by objectively, I think what I really mean here is empirically accurately, right? So if you go out and find that in fact there are not important differences in experience, perceived experiences, then that is, critical to report and not to sort of adjust your understanding or try to make your analysis fit later, right? Not trying to make your data fit your analysis, but rather actually taking time to collect those data and understand the analysis. The other thing I'd say on racial inequality is that a lot of it actually is empirical and not subjective. So the reasons behind it, so this goes in part to Justin's point that one of the big differences with academic work is that we're testing a theory in collecting those data, but oftentimes the kinds of data that you're collecting as a journalist include like how many people, experienced one thing, how many people voted, how many people were arrested by police, how many women who gave birth died within a year of giving birth, right? These are very sort of clear objective data. Now then you're going to try to bring meaning to those, right? And it may not be that you have the ability to show clear causal relationships if you haven't done, or if the data don't lend themselves to being able to show a single causal story. But I don't think that simply because the data themselves are subjective that you can't write a clear empirical story about what those data show. Justin, would you agree with that, General?
Well, so let's just start with like looking at the issues that are mentioned here: racial and gender inequalities. Inequality is a factual assessment, right? So, for example, if we want to focus on income inequalities, we can, as a matter of fact, establish whether they exist. We also may be able to establish, as a matter of fact, whether race or gender causes the inequality, and whether which mechanisms it goes through, right? Because there are lots of ways in which that can happen. Those things, if we can't, journalism is at least in large part about facts, right? We need to be able to agree on the same facts. And I think going back to the previous question, what I think we should be trying to do with data visualization in most journalism is to clarify facts. Now, there is another step there, which is, is this the most important thing we need to be addressing? Is this a moral responsibility for some particular racial or gender group to solve? Is it right or wrong? Is it because of racism or something? Those become a little more subjective, and I'm not sure. In fact, in some cases, I am sure I can't answer that with a data visualization. And also, I may have a sort of a large scale theory about like how colonialism is, influencing, the patterns of production and wealth accumulation. I'm probably not going to be able to resolve that in a New York Times article or a book even, right? It's because it's not just a fact, it's actually an explanation and a model. So long story short, some of the models that we have, it might be hard to objectively decide whether they're correct or incorrect, because as we know from the philosophy of science, models are actually always incorrect. They can be more or less useful. But I do think even in this modern age, there is such a thing as a fact, and we ought to be able to agree on the standards of evidence that establish those facts.
I'll do one more thing. I don't know, are the slides still available for our director who's out there? I wonder if we can see the slides again. There was, if they are, at the end of my presentation, there are 3 slides I didn't show. And so I could show those also tomorrow, just to build on a point that Justin made. So there's one that starts with inequality versus inequity. Great, there it is. All right, so this is not, to be clear, a data visualization. There are no data here. This is a theoretical visualization, but I just want to show you these 3 back to back, just as a way of like, sometimes you can tell all the stories in the world and you'll actually end up in being less clear than you can in just a couple of visual presentation. So again, just thinking about how you want to do your storytelling. So I bet many of us have at some point, and if you haven't yet, someone will force you to go to a DEI training and they'll show you something like this, right? That is showing equality versus equity. And right, this idea that equality means everybody gets the same thing, but actually people need different things, right? I wish I could see all of my Student Nation people right now, because I'd say, hey, who has seen this before? Right, but this is a version that is meant to say, this is sort of for the pro-equity people who are saying equality seems good, but actually equality can leave people without what they need or can give things to people that are not useful. All right, if you go to the next slide, you'll see a critique of this particular 2-slide equality versus equity, but you'll see it from kind of what I would call a left critique, right? So the left critique adds 2 panels to this slide. It adds what it's calling a reality panel, right? Saying it's not just that everybody has the same, it's that actually in reality, people don't even have equality, right? That some group has way, way more. And it's not just that the last person does still not have enough, but it actually begins in a hole, right? So that is a theoretical claim, right? That's an ideological claim, even on what reality constitutes. And you'll see, again, this is a left critique. And so the critique says, why are we, building boxes or ramps for people? What we should be doing is taking down the structural barrier, right? Now, sometimes this visualization bugs me because now you've taken down the barrier to the baseball game, and it does look like the pitch is going to come straight at these people. So I'm not clear that that's really good for anybody, right? But you can see how without many, many paragraphs of words, you can just in those two slides. Now, I want to see the third slide, which is a critique of the equality equity. And this is a critique coming from the right? So the other one was a critique coming from the left. This is a critique coming from the right. And it's saying, all right, here's equality, here's equity in theory, right? So this is kind of what the progressives are putting up in the world. But what equity really does, right, is it actually leaves everybody incapable of seeing the game, right? It saws, and if you look, that's the saw of social justice, folks, right? So that is the saw that has come and actually literally taken the legs off the other two. It's basically, think of that social justice saw as like taxation, right? So taxation or redistribution, right? Taking from some presumably to give to others, but from the right critique, right? The critique suggests that actually nobody gets better as a result. So I wanted you to see those three because, again, those are not data visualizations. Those are not based in data. They're actually based in a theory, but it's still showing you the ways that sometimes using a visualization, but you do have to use it, again, responsibly, right? You can use that visualization to talk about subjective critiques. You can say, this is kind of a DEI presentation. This is a critique from the left. This is a critique from the right. But those three slides will often tell you more about what is encompassed in those critiques and can make them more accessible, right, to folks who aren't sort of steeped in that language all the time. Okay. Another question is coming, and this is a bit more, just I'm giving this one to you here. Do you have particular strategies for combating confirmation bias and drawing attention to the bigger picture that data might be telling us? And this is, I think, important because we did this with our students a lot, even when the conclusions are maybe not sensational.
Well, this is actually sort of a scientific question, right? It's really asking how people use information to come to conclusions. And there's a lot of study of that question in psychology and political science. And so I guess I'll just start off with the observation that probably you're not going to solve the problem of confirmation bias in one graph or one visualization in your article, because a part of what's going on here is people selecting sources or people discounting some bit of evidence that you have offered because of their pre-existing ideas. I do think we can, as best as possible, foreclose some of the most obvious critiques of our work that might be prompted by confirmation bias. So, for example, I mentioned, you want to rule out the possibility of confounding or of reverse causality when you are doing a data visualization. And that is in part because you don't want people reading it to have a very easy way to explain away what you're saying. Also, just parenthetically, you don't want the critique to be good, right? You don't want them to have a good point. You want to be a good social scientist and be, as best you can, be presenting things that are real. I will, however, say, and perhaps our PhD student can verify this, what you learn more than anything else in a PhD program is how to criticize things. And at a certain point, you become so good at it that I think I can say pretty confidently, and this relates to the earlier thing I said about models, there's no piece of evidence that I can't find a problem with. It's because there's no such thing as a flawless, completely. If it were flawless and completely transparent, you would have a copy of the world, right? You would literally have the thing you're studying in your hand. And so given that we can't achieve that, there's always the possibility for confirmation bias, right? There's always a possibility for someone to say, oh, that's not true because blah, blah, blah. Well, in any one article, any one visualization, you're not going to combat that. But over time, with, sort of addressing those critiques one by one and working on a long time on some issue or some story, you perhaps can get to a point where the objections are so fanciful that they don't convince reasonable, disinterested observers who are disproportionately young people, right? There are quite a few theories of change that basically say social change or any change doesn't happen via changing minds. It happens via generational replacement. And I'm not sure that's actually 100% true, but I do think it's the case that you want to be telling a story that, how you want to avoid confirmation bias in yourself, right? Mm-hmm. And you want to make sure that you are addressing the things you have control over, which is your own propensity to find data that matches with the things you like. And the rest you just need to leave to, to the ability of people to be convinced over time by good work. That's not, unfortunately, that's not a very, oh, well, you click this button and then it goes away. But that's the best answer I have, I think.
And that is truly, it's the nature of confirmation bias in quantitative, analysis, but it's also true of how we have to approach work as journalists. So, I lead a team of really brilliant young producers, but we're also producing, every day a new show. And confirmation bias is the easiest thing, right? If you see a story that fits sort of how your worldview is, Bank of America is evil. Wells Fargo should be brought down. Whatever it is, especially you like a progressive, smart, and now you have the mic. One of the hardest things to do is to slow down enough to ask, okay, this fits with how I see the world, but what's the evidence here, right? Like, have we really in our reporting shown this, or are we reading something here? Are we wanting to pitch the story and talk about it just because it feels right to us? Is there a way that we can kind of get underneath that story, look at it a different way? And what I'll say is that it does take time. Serena Zetz asked me whether I have tips for how young journalists create conditions and opportunities to encourage interview subjects to want to share their voices and perspectives. And I guess I'll say two things about that. One, you're going to likely find over time that is not a huge problem, in the sense that in the world, people are often not listened to at all. And when you provide an opportunity for someone to speak and to be heard, I think it's a thing, again, that can be very easy to forget when you do have a column or a pen or an outlet or a forum. You forget that the vast majority of human beings on the planet do not have that. Even if they have their own Twitter or Facebook account, it's still really hard to know that you're speaking and actually having someone hear you. So if you're standing there with a mic, or even more powerfully, and only by powerful, I mean people will really show out in front of cameras. But if you're standing there with a camera or with a mic or even with a pen, you will often find people are willing to tell you their stories. I think the ethical question the question for journalists is a slightly different one. It's not how do we get people to tell us, because people will tell you in really stunning circumstances. The question is, what do you do when you have somebody's story? Someone has told you something, even if it doesn't seem to you as something that needs to be kept confidential or anonymous, even if it doesn't seem particularly precious, I promise you that it is. And you have to be very careful about how you think about what it means once you have someone's story. Now, for us in audio journalism, it means how do you edit it, right? So if somebody gives me a 5-minute explanation of their feelings about a topic, and I only have 50 seconds, not 5 minutes. How do I edit 5 minutes into 50 seconds? How do I know I'm capturing not what fits best for the story I want to tell, but the story that they've told? And again, I think there's no exact science here, but I think even remembering to ask that. And then the second thing I'll say is actually something I learned from Dave Zirin here at The Nation. Dave is one of these journalists who doesn't really have sources. He has relationships. Dave is extremely committed to the idea that journalists in our relationship with our so-called sources should not be transactional. We should be transformational. That we can be just as evil as a Wells Fargo or a Bank of America if our relationships are exclusively extractive. I got a show to do. I got a column to write. I've got a whatever. You have the information I need. Please come give me your information. I will extract that from you. I will present it, and everyone will think I'm so smart and great because I have gone and taken your story and extracted it from you. That is how much of journalism, audio, and broadcast and print ends up working. And I guess what I'd say is slow down if you can. And I know it's really hard, but slow down enough to ask, wait a minute, if this were my story and I gave it to someone, right? This is just one way, like if this was my story of my incarcerated parent, if this was my story of sleeping in a subway station in my country as it's being invaded by an autocrat, if this was my story of even my great story, right? Even if this is my story of winning the National Spelling Bee, what would I want someone to do with it? What would feel good to me? What do I want to hear back about myself? And, do I ever want to hear from that person again? If I cross that person's path again and I'm like, oh, I talked to you about winning the spelling bee, how do I want that journalist to react and to respond? And what if later I need something from that journalist? Can I call them? Do I have their contact information? Is it fully extractive or is it in relationship? And sometimes you will be extractive, but I am going to just encourage you that you will feel better about the work that you produce, and you will find that many of those long-term relationships are extraordinarily productive in ways you can't fathom when you initially connect with someone. It does take time to manage relationships, but it will be among the most important data investments you ever make.
I've been thinking about that a lot. I'm not an expert on this by any means, but I watch a lot of CNN these days because of what's going on in the world. And I think a lot about this question when, you're interviewing people who are literally under fire. You can extract all you want from me, right? A cold expert sitting in an office, that's okay, right? But, if someone's trying to blow up my house, that's a different matter.
Mm-hmm. And we face it all the time. Sometimes it's what's happening in Ukraine. So often it is after a mass shooting, people are still, we know from the data, right? People are still in shock, and we're shoving microphones in their face. And I want to be clear, it's not an entirely wrong thing to do. Right now, we need to hear from the people in Ukraine. This cannot just be a story told by reporters. On the other hand, you as a reporter need to really think about what it means to be holding that story. Do you ever call again to find out what happened to that person? Do you track at all what happened to that family at the border? Even if you don't ever go on air with it again, I think that it absolutely matters. Madeline asks, to Justin's point on using data to show what avenues injustices are coming from when these data are intersectional and complex, what do we do when data fails us in some way or can't fit on an XY axis? How can we make clear as data journalists that one graph can't tell the whole story?
Well, I think this is true not just in journalism, but also in science. You're never going to write the last paper about a subject, academic or journalism, right? And I sometimes joke like, oh, I wrote this paper on whatever, gender quotas and corruption, and that's the final word. That you can take that right to the bank, right? that's just not true. Even in the natural sciences, where we do have a little more certainty, I think, at least on some dimensions. Rarely do you write the last paper on something. You're part of, as a scientist and as a journalist, you're part of a conversation that goes all the way back to ancient Greece, right? And before, probably, we just don't have written records before. And so I don't worry too much about not telling the whole story in one graph, because I just know that's never going to happen anyway. So what I want to do is make sure that visualization is communicating something that's important, and as best I can establish it, that it's true. And so when we're talking about, for example, how identity changes our experience in the economy or in the polity, that's where, right, as you say, there's going to be it's going to be a complex story, because these identities interact with one another. They could change in their meaning across region or across country or across state. So you're not going to end up being able to tell the story of what it means to be Black in America or what it means to be Hispanic in America. You just can't do that in one story. So don't worry about that, and don't claim it, right? Just make sure that what you're doing is communicating something that is going to make the conversation continue in a productive and informative way. That's I guess, I'm not sure what do you think about that, Melissa?
Yeah, I mean, actually, in many ways, it's the point you made about don't claim to be saying this, right? And also, and this one's really hard. You got to be willing to make corrections when you've been wrong. Even if you weren't exactly wrong. So let me just give you an example. In about maybe 2017 or 18 or so, it was during the Obama years. So maybe it was 2015, 16. There was a 1,000 million headlines that said Black women are the most college educated, or the most educated group in America. And it was just coming out of this one little data point that showed that Black women were most likely in any given year or semester, the category that was Black and woman, most likely to enroll in college. It's also true that Black women are among the least likely to actually graduate from college. So what happens is you get this one little data point about enrollment, and it becomes a gabillion headlines that say Black women are the most educated people in America. I mean, so first I just ask you to gut check that. How could that possibly, that is so patently, obviously, clearly either wrong data or wrong analysis of that data, right? It's okay to have counterintuitive findings, but not findings that turn the world all the way upside down and make none of the power relationships that exist real. And it clearly seemed to me that these were headlines emerging out of what I would call the Obama fog. We were so hyped behind the Obamas being in office that we somehow thought that Black women had just run out into the streets and all gone to college and finished. It's actually really quite the opposite. It's a story about people who are enrolling, but you have to remember that college mostly here meant community colleges, mostly meant for-profit colleges. It's actually indicative of, and so the disparity between entering, right, enrolling versus finishing was such an enormous disparity, in large part because of student loan debt. So there's actually really interesting story there, but the headline was wrong. So if you're the headline writer, you got to go back and correct that, because it's still I still occasionally see articles and pieces where people will cite it. But also, if you're the data source and people are getting it wrong, I'll also say that you have a responsibility, even if you presented the data accurately, if it is being misconstrued in that way, I think it's important to enter into the public conversation about it. The last thing I want to address in 2 seconds, Ashley Castillo asked about both about journalists, disabled journalists living with disabilities, and also about starting in the broadcasting industry right out of college with little or no experience. What I'd say is, yes, there's many disabled journalists who I have, you asked if I have come across, who I know, who I work with. Melissa Thompson is one of my favorite voices on the question of disability rights. She's an extraordinary journalist. She has She both reports as well as hosts podcasts. If you go to Ramp Your Voice, she's got a Ramp Your Voice project, which is really quite lovely. But also, if you're looking for sort of communities of journalists living with and reporting on disability, if you go to the Disability Visibility Project, that's actually in connection with StoryCorps, and there's whole sections there around disabled journalists. And I'd also say have potentially have the broadest possible vision of that. So if we're thinking about journalists who are living also with emotional and psychological disabilities, mental health challenges, what I'd say is there are often members of our teams, of our production teams, of our newsrooms who might not have physical disabilities that you can clearly identify from the outside, but who are navigating disability in the work that they're doing. I will say that part of what we try to do in our work is to ensure that when we're doing disability stories, we're also talking with and through journalists living with disabilities and writing often for sources that are primarily disability-based sources. And then how to get started in broadcast. First of all, nobody has any experience. No matter how much experience you have, you're always learning on the job. It's always changing. And the whole process of journalism right now is changing a lot. But I would say that the more that you are a creator, and that you can evidence what you've created, the more interesting you become as an applicant at every level. So remember, you don't have to be creating for a paid source. You might be creating on a YouTube channel. You might be creating, on your Medium page. But if I can click and read what you write, even if it's self-published on Medium, if you're like, I reported out the story, it, wasn't in a major media source, but I put it up on YouTube. Then when I'm hiring, I love to be able to see work product, particularly things that you pitched it to yourself, you thought it was an important idea, and then you processed it all the way through. It doesn't have to be completely shiny and perfect and as though you had, $20,000 to produce this. If you had, $1.20 to produce it, it will still give me as a hiring manager something really valuable. So I would encourage you to be a creator, and then to put the links to your creation on your resumes. It will help you to stand out. Also, please goodness, spend time writing a really good cover letter. The number of student interns I have simply turned back because the cover letter had grammar matters in journalism. So,
and let me make a quick pitch for if you're still in college, especially acquire skills, right? So clear, logical writing, quantitative analysis and visualization, but also foreign languages, right? If you speak Russian or Arabic, you are in a great, or Chinese, you're in a great position, or even, French or Spanish, right? You're in a great position relative to other people. Technical skills, meaning like IT skills, can also be helpful. Something that, the typical journalist does not have. That, those things can be really helpful and they can distinguish you.
We're at time. Ashley asked me to say again, Melissa Thompson's name, but again, go to Ramp Your Voice, and also Disability Visibility those are the two sources I'm citing there. And again, I'm also, the Disability Visibility Project, disabilityvisibilityproject.com and Ramp Your Voice are just two, out of many, many, many. Justin, it's always nice to hang out with you, spend a little bit of time. And I don't know if there's someone who's coming or if we're just supposed to say, goodbye.
And scene.
That's right. And